very briefly, progression-free survival is sort of generally defined as the point at which you enter a trial, a study, and the point at which progression of the cancer can be measured by some means, versus an overall survival endpoint of the trial where the endpoint is, sadly, death. So the decision on whether to use progression-free survival or overall survival as an endpoint for clinical trials may seem academic, but it really ceases to be academic when it begins to affect patients' ability to access treatments. What elements of this debate about PFS versus OS do we as advocates need to ensure that are brought forward?
One of the roles that our organization plays is we try and stress that progression-free survival is very, very, very important to a patient, and that it should be, by organizations, it should be looked at as highly as overall survival is, because that means just as much to a patient to not have their disease to continue to progress.
Because I think that we've seen in a lot of diseases where there is a proxy measure for outcomes. So, for example, in HIV, viral load is an amazing proxy for disease measurement. In many cancers, there are some biomarkers, like ovarian cancer has CA125, but there's not necessarily a good proxy between PFS and OS, and there was a poster downstairs this morning about ovarian cancer that showed that. And so the question is, I guess maybe back to your question earlier, is what is the value? And is there a value? And is the only thing we should be looking at overall survival? The FDA is trending towards only looking at overall survival. They won't, it seems, really approve a drug based on PFS, but also quality of life data isn't included in that. So if PFS is giving somebody relief from ascites or other issues, that's not taken into account. And so maybe PFS is important, but maybe there are other things besides PFS and OS that we can look at, like quality of life.
So what's our role as an advocacy community in this debate? What should we be doing? What placard should we be holding on this?
And I've, for 4 years, have served on the Oncology Drug Advisory Committee for the FDA. So I've had that role of being involved in the policymaking discussions, albeit just recommendations. The committee does not make the final decision. But that it's an issue that for 4 years we've been dealing with and struggling through. Do you use PFS as a surrogate endpoint? But when we were talking about quality of life issues, I think that's a role where the advocates really need to take a strong position in developing really good measurement tools that will capture that kind of data, because most of it's anecdotal, and that's just not going to hold up in a regulatory area. And as a patient myself, I'm a survivor, and I know what it's like to measure for myself whether I want to take the risk-benefit of a treatment and what that will mean for me. And so I'm there to represent the patients and the greater consumer community, which is not one voice. It's a challenge. But I think right now we do not have good quality of life measurement tools, and it's going to be different for an initially diagnosed patient and the metastatic population, which is another issue that the committee has really struggled with. And whether overall survival is really something you can look at in a metastatic population who have been heavily pretreated.
I personally serve as a patient advocate for the National Cancer Institute Thoracic Malignancy Steering Committee, and one of the things that those steering committees do is review trials that are coming through the cooperative groups, and there is a quality of life expert on every single concept that's coming through to analyze, has the concept addressed quality of life issues? Is it appropriate for them to address it? And what I wonder about is, what about the trials that we're not seeing? Because there's plenty going on that are outside the cooperative groups that don't necessarily have advocates involved in. Do we have a role there of reaching out to our pharmaceutical partners, our private research organizations, what have you, and saying, hey, we want in the door, we want to be part of this so that we can help?
So I think the other issue with overall survival is that if we do start getting more people into trials, and especially earlier in their disease, it's going to take longer, and there are going to be possibly, probably, other intervening treatments, it's going to be hard to isolate that original treatment to overall survival. And so what we're doing now is looking at overall survival, and we're kind of looking at it as treatments at the end of life almost. And so it's very confounding. And so I think there's probably a role for the patient advocate groups to, come together and work out whether it's a white paper or position statement, and work with our industry friends, work with the government agencies that do trials, and figure out how to address all of these issues.
I could ask a question about quality of life. I think it's a very interesting debate. This is a very highly technical issue, and as you say, I think very beautifully, a big debate about it. And there are some diseases in which progression-free survival does correlate with overall survival, some which they don't. And your sense of how things are confounded along the cancer patient's journey, because of the greater variety of drugs, we have second, third line treatments. So how do we tease out which does which? As a very dry academic, progression-free survival does give you a biological readout as to whether the new treatment is having some effect or not. That's useful. But having a trial that shows statistically significantly there's a 1-month improvement in progression-free survival is a very difficult thing to see how we fit that in a population sense into, it's back to value again and looking at things that way. In the old days when we kicked off and things were simpler, we powered everything in overall survival because we didn't have many tools or many drugs. But we're living in a much more complicated life now, and I think we need to sort of tease things out. As for quality of life, it was imposed on us. So our trials offices, our government said, if you're doing a cancer trial, you've got to collect quality of life data. And we said, if it means we get the money, we'll do it. But I hated it. It was meaningless gobbledygook. They didn't change anybody's mind ever. Now, those are rather strange statements, and I should retract them and blah, blah, blah. But I'm not going to, because they are, and worryingly so, and the death threats will follow and all the rest of it. But the quality of life tools we've got are crude, they're insensitive, they don't reflect the patient experience, they haven't really influenced anything I've ever done. The data are very difficult and complex to gather and to analyse. Much of the data are missing, and it just doesn't quite sort of work for us. And I think, again, a lot of thought needs to go into having a truly reflective genetic tool that gives a sense of the patient's experience sufficiently to say that we would use that as a value hook to hang a whole new regulatory thing on. The current stuff just doesn't cut it for me at all.
Diane, do you think as a culture we have a sense of entitlement about choice?
Well, I don't know if it's a sense of entitlement, but I think we do live in, it's become clearer to me, I guess, in the past few years with the whole healthcare debate that we have this strong kind of individualistic strain in our culture that we believe strongly that people should be able to make their own choices. And, everything we talked about comes back to that discussion, really. We had the clinical trials discussion. There are a lot of patients who don't want to be on clinical trials even when they understand it because they want to do their own thing and they see that as an imposition. I think it is very strong in our culture. It's actually become more apparent to me recently as our politics have changed some, but it does interfere is a negative word. It's a value word, but it has impact on really everything we're talking about of how we see ourselves. And I think, NICE gets a lot of flack in the UK, but it is accepted as part of the way health insurance, the way people are insured and how they get their care. Where in this country, it's seen as this imposition that would be interference.
How do we balance choice and evidence? The discussion that we had about third or fourth line chemotherapy for disease X, in which there is no evidence whatsoever, apart from evidence of toxicity, of life abbreviation, and choosing or opting for that, or whatever the sometimes perverse incentives in the healthcare system are that drive people down that way, that doesn't feel like choice. That feels like bad medicine to me. Shouldn't we be saying no? That we've just run out of evidence, we've run out of drugs, we've run out of time, and therefore the discussion is a different preparatory one. Or are you allowed to choose bad medicine? I'm saying it very strongly.
People do it every day. So, I think, I'm very driven by this concept of evidence, as probably most people in this room are. But, medicine is also an art. I sat at a meeting last week looking at endpoints in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Talk about esoteric conversations here. But, it's a mushy kind of thing of when a drug works and where is the evidence and how long do you treat people. And some of the physicians in the room who are experts in this said very clearly, there really is an art. This isn't just the evidence that you can go on. So it isn't as clear cut. In the best of all possible worlds, we would all only get medicine that has absolute evidence attached to it. We also live in a country for getting cancer, where people are terribly over-medicated for all kinds of things that didn't used to be medicalized things. But there are lots of reasons that's done. So I don't want to just say these are complicated issues and throw up our hands and we can't do anything about it. But I think to have these discussions, and again, I come as my role as someone who, runs a patient organization and has for a long time, that it is important and it's a role we can play without marching. I mean, marching is a whole other level, but it is a role we can play to try and educate the people who we come in contact with every day about some of these concepts. You don't always convince them. There's no way you always convince them, because there is this idea usually that more is better, and it's hard to get away from that idea. But I think we do have some responsibility not to tell people, well, you shouldn't get this or you shouldn't get that. That's not our business. But to help people understand these questions. There are really interesting things going on now with the overuse of PET scans. A lot of people want PET scans for surveillance after treatment, extraordinarily expensive, not evidence-based, and we can play a role in explaining to people about how it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference in how they do, so that they aren't in the position of saying, because a lot of doctors will tell you, well, I do this because the patient says that they want it. So I'm a big believer, both in my career and my role at cancer.net, is we don't just educate patients, we don't just educate the professional, you really have to educate on the other side of the equation, so you get some consistency in this discussion, because without it, you're going to get things that are driven by what the patient wants, maybe inappropriately, or maybe driven by the physician who is reimbursed by making more money, or doesn't know, or malpractice. I mean, who knows what he or she is motivated by. But you really do need to be looking at both sides of that equation all the time. And that's what the people in this room can do. I mean, that's why they do the work they do.
We were privileged at our annual meeting on Friday to have Jennifer Temmel speak. She recently published a study in which early integrated palliative care was incorporated into care of lung cancer patients. Single institution study, but a randomized controlled trial. And they were not told don't get chemotherapy. They were given it while they were given chemotherapy. There was not only outstanding response in terms of fewer people having futile chemotherapy at end of life. There were more people using hospice. There were fewer people doing unnecessary resuscitations. But the people and their families felt better. And most surprisingly, there was a 3-month survival benefit.
They were educated.
That they were educated. They were educated on receiving palliative care early in their treatment. And I do think there's a role for all of us as advocates to say every single cancer patient should have the opportunity to access comprehensive palliative care the minute they're diagnosed. Because it's not just end-of-life care. It's how do you make decisions about cost and value? How do you make decisions about hospice? How do you make decisions about living wills? Those types of things. And they are all integrated into quality care, and it's incumbent upon all of us, as well as our physician colleagues, to make sure that that is part of the discussion at the point of diagnosis. I'll be an advocate for that.
Fantastic. Get marching.
Good marching.
That's right.
I would encourage you, since this is an ongoing initiative now, we're taking this on the road, we're doing more and more AIAs, not only in the US, but in Europe. One of the ideas that we've had was to hold some kind of communications, basically a summit, for the advocates from the US and in Europe to sit down at a round table and begin to hash out these issues and try to form some kind of a cohesive entity that we can partner on a global level. One, I want to thank all of you, and really this panel, because this could not be done without the expertise of individuals who are extremely well-versed. I hope you have a very successful rest of your ASCO meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selma.